Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the TCEQ's compliance webinar for stormwater multi-sector general permit monitoring and reporting in Net DMR. My name is Tara Gilbert, and I will be your moderator today. Please take a moment to complete the attendance form linked in the live event Q&A on the right side of the screen. Attendees will not be able to speak during today's webinar, but you can use the Q&A to ask a question at any time. We will do our best to answer your questions in the Q&A and after each presentation. If we run out of time before we answer your question, or if you have a site-specific question, please email us and we can communicate with you individually. For Net DMR program questions, you can email netdmr@tceq.texas.gov. And for general stormwater permitting, you can email swpermit@tceq.texas.gov. Our two presenters today are Michaela Coleman from the TCEQ Stormwater team and Asa Bingham from the Compliance Monitoring section. The webinar is split into two live presentations, and we will take time for questions after each half with the presenters. We will take a 10-minute break between presentations. And now for our first presenter, Michaela Coleman.
Thank you very much. As she said, my name's Michaela Coleman. I'm a permit writer on the stormwater team here at TCEQ in the Water Quality Division. So for this first presentation, my goal is really to make sure we're all refamiliarized with what exactly the multi-sector general permit is. And then we'll go through the different monitoring types within the multi-sector general permit and start to talk about how those monitoring types are going to appear for our permittees in the Net DMR system. And we'll look at some examples based on how a specific permittee answers questions on their notice of intent, and then based on that, what that permittee should then see in the Net DMR system. So I'm focused more on talking about the general permit requirements itself, and then how each permittee's application under the general permit are going to inform what shows up in Net DMR. And then in the second presentation, we'll actually get to really look at the Net DMR system with Asa. So this is a quick look at the current multi-sector general permit. It was issued August 14, 2021, so just here pretty recently. All of our general permits have a 5-year life cycle, which means this general permit will be effective until August 14 of 2026. And of course, the multi-sector general permit is the stormwater general permit, which allows for discharges of stormwater associated with industrial activity, as well as certain non-stormwater discharges. And so that means stormwater discharges that are directly related to these facilities' manufacturing or processing and storage areas at the industrial facility. This permit is required for only certain kinds of industrial activities, and those are going to be defined in the federal rules in 40 Code of Federal Regulations 122.26 B14I through 11. So if you're curious, you can go read that, but it's basically describing all the different industries that we talk about in the general permit itself. And so coverage then is based upon your primary standard industrial classification code, or an SIC code, and activity codes, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a second. Coverage could also be based on a facility having discharges that are subject to federal effluent guidelines. You know, those are also described in the federal rules. So specifically, that's in 40 CFR parts 400 to 471. And then based on this information, we divide the permittees into 30 sectors, and the sector is just how we group similar activities under the general permit. And they're labeled A through AD. So standard industrial classification codes, or SIC codes, are a 4-digit length number that it's based on the revenue for a regulated activity. So they're not something that TCEQ or even EPA assigns to anyone. They're really based on a facility's tax information. So what activity is your business performing that makes you the most money, that is going to be your primary standard industrial classification code. So for example, if you happen to be Jim Beam and you make distilled and blended liquors, then your SIC code would be 2085. We also use activity codes because there are certain kinds of industrial processes that aren't usually well described with an SIC code because maybe revenue isn't a big part of that industry group. And so those are as follows on the screen. We have just 4 of them. HZ is the activity code for hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal. LF is for landfill, SC for steam electric power plants, and TW for treatment works, or like a wastewater treatment plant, shown on the right there. So the permit has a description of both primary SIC codes and secondary SIC codes. So primary is just like I described before. It's going to be that actual product, or maybe it's a group of products that makes this operation the most revenue, or it could employ the most personnel for that activity. So the thing that primarily describes what the business is doing. Secondary SIC codes could be describing a secondary industrial activity. So a second thing that's happening at the facility that is described by another SIC code, but it's not the primary source of income or the primary use of employees at a facility. So for example, in the green box on the right side of the screen, there's this business, Handy Metal Works LLC, and they produce metal cans and pressure tanks, but their greatest revenue comes from their metal cans. So that would mean that their primary SIC code is going to be the one that describes metal can manufacturing, 3411, while their secondary SIC code would describe the pressure tanks. So that's 3443. So they're going to have 2 SIC codes, one of them being primary and one of them being secondary. The MSGP also requires municipal operated facilities or military bases and other federal facilities are required to obtain permit coverage if they're performing activities described by one of the codes in the permit. And then we also have information about co-located activities and co-located facilities. So co-located activities is for a facility that's doing more than one kind of activity, or they have more than one SIC code, like Handy Metal Works in the example on the previous slide. So that operator would be then required to comply with all of the requirements in the permit for those 2 different activities. Sometimes that means you might have to comply with more than one sector in the permit, or at the very least, you have to comply with the requirements that are specific to those SIC codes. It could be within the same sector. Co-located facilities, however, describes when there's more than one operator at the same location. A great example is an airport. So airports have a lot of tenants, and each of those tenants might be performing an industrial activity, but they're separate operators. So they're going to have their own authorizations and coverage under the general permit, even though they're all located at the same facility or the same airport. Under the multi-sector general permit, there are 3 types of authorization that somebody could seek. The first one is a notice of intent, or an NOI. And so this is kind of the traditional form of coverage. You've identified that you need coverage under this general permit. And so you're going to submit your notice of intent, and you'll be issued a unique authorization number. And for the NOIs, those always start with TXR05, and then you get a 4 numeric alpha code that's specific to you on the end of that. And so that means you're fully having to comply with all the requirements in the permit, including monitoring, which is the subject of today. The next kind is a no exposure certification, or an NEC. And this is for facilities that, they're technically required to have permit coverage, but maybe they're not really doing anything out of doors, where everything that they're doing is really protected from precipitation and stormwater. And so it's almost like a waiver from permit coverage. So they're still applying under the permit and they have to maintain no exposure, but they don't have quite all of the requirements that somebody with a notice of intent has. There's not the monitoring or the SWIP requirements. And so if somebody applies for an NEC, they too get a specific authorization number, but this time it's going to start with TXRNE, and then it'll get their 4-digit alphanumeric code that's specific to that facility. And then the third and final authorization type is automatic. And for the automatic authorization, we don't require an application because it's automatic. And then because we're not getting an application, we're not assigning a specific authorization. And this is described in the permit under very limited circumstances. Somebody could be automatically authorized. It's things like, you know, maybe your business is done out of your home or in a shopping mall, something like that. So it's pretty limited cases where somebody could be automatically authorized and they wouldn't be required to submit the application. So since we're talking about monitoring today, we're really focused on those folks that have a notice of intent coverage under the general permit. So like I kind of described already, the notice of intent is available to anybody who's eligible for permit coverage, and it requires compliance with all of the elements of the permit, including monitoring. And then that no exposure certification is only for our facilities that have absolutely no exposure of their materials and activities to stormwater and precipitation. So that usually means that things are conducted inside a building or under a storm resistant shelter. And our operators are then certifying that nothing that they're doing is exposed to stormwater. And because of that certification, then they don't have the sampling requirements or the inspections and the SWIP requirements that our notice of intent authorizations do. So now we can really dive into the different monitoring and sampling requirements under the multi-sector general permit. And specifically, we're going to, of course, focus on what needs to go into the Net DMR system. So what are you required to report in Net DMR? These 4 types of monitoring would require reporting in Net DMR. First, the hazardous metals monitoring, the sector-specific numeric effluent limits, our benchmark monitoring, and then monitoring for impaired waters and pollutants of concern. And so I'm going to take a minute to talk about each of those types, and then we'll dive into some examples. So the first is hazardous metals monitoring. This is a monitoring type that's required by every single one of the permittees that have an NOI, regardless of what your activity is, what sector you fall in, what your SIC code is, and it's based on a state rule. So in the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 319, there's a list of all the hazardous metals and the limits, and so that's where that's coming from. That's why everyone has to do it. It requires sampling once per year, so once per calendar year. By December 31, every permittee should collect and analyze a sample for their hazardous metals, and then you would be required to report those hazardous metals results by March 31st of the following year, only if there's an exceedance. So that's always been the case in the permit. If you never exceed your hazardous metals, you just keep a record of it in your own documentation. You don't actually have to submit that information to TCEQ. And so because of that, we have these set up in the Net DMR system as what's called an unscheduled limit, meaning the system isn't going to be flagging if they don't receive anything for your hazardous metals. So we're keeping it the same. You're only going to have to report in Net DMR if there is an exceedance in that unscheduled limit set, which you'll get to see some of whenever ASA goes through what the Net DMR system looks like. And then there is a waiver option available for some permittees to waive out of hazardous metals monitoring. So if you are eligible and you're implementing that waiver, you have to tell us on your application or through a notice of change. You know, maybe you applied back in August to get coverage under the permit and you have since started implementing that waiver. You need to submit a change to TCEQ to let us know so that we can adjust what's going to appear in Net DMR. You can have that submitted, and so we have a record that you're implementing the waiver. And if that's the case, then it wouldn't show up in Net DMR. You can also report with a no data indicator or a NODI code in the system, which again, you'll get to see whenever ASA goes through and shows, what the Net DMR system looks like. So those codes basically are an opportunity for you to say, I wasn't required to monitor for this, so I'm just going to put the code in that says that. So this is a look at those hazardous metals. There's several of them, and again, these come directly from the state rules, chapter 319. If you're interested, you can go take a read, but there's different limits depending on if you discharge to inland waters or tidal waters. And so you may recognize whenever you're filling out an application for the MSGP, you have to tell us if you're discharging to an inland water or a tidal water. And that's going to inform our Net DMR system as to what the limit is for you as a permittee discharging, one of these hazardous metals. The next monitoring type is sector-specific numeric effluent limits, or the federal effluent guidelines. So these are those monitoring types that's coming directly from the federal rules. So it only applies to certain facilities. Specifically, it falls under sectors A, C, D, E, J, O, and S. And so in order for you to see this in Net DMR, you're really only going to see it in Net DMR if you're answering on your application, either your notice of intent or later with a notice of change, that you are subject to this kind of monitoring. So there's questions on your application to say, do you perform this kind of activity that's requires this monitoring in the federal rules? And again, the federal rule section is in 40 Code of Federal Regulations, parts 400 to 471. So it's not necessarily going to be applicable to everybody. You have to actually be performing the activity that's described there to have this apply to you in your facility. But if it does apply to you, you're required to collect a sample once per year, have it analyzed by December 31st, and then you would report that analyses by March 31 of the following year. And for the most part, these are going to appear in the Net DMR system as a scheduled limit, because we want to know whether you exceed or do not exceed. So those are scheduled. We expect monitoring to be submitted every year by March 31 in the Net DMR system if you're required to do this kind of monitoring. So here's an example of one of the kinds of sector-specific numeric effluent limits. This is the kind that we have described under Sector O in the permit. So it's specifically for our Sector O facilities that have coal pile runoff. So if you were a steam electric generating facility that had coal piles and there was any runoff from them, then you would be required to perform this kind of monitoring. And so in Net DMR, you would see that you have requirements to report for total suspended solids and pH. The next monitoring type is benchmark monitoring. So this applies to a lot of our permittees, but not quite all of them. So it's for certain facilities in 21 out of our 30 sectors, and it's based on everybody's specific SIC code. So benchmark monitoring requires 2 samples to be collected and analyzed semi-annually. So we have kind of 2 sampling periods in a year. So you should collect 1 sample from January to June and another from July to December of each year. And then you would be required to report the average annual result by March 31 of the following year. So that's 2 samples minimum, and then you report the average. Now, it's important to note that benchmarks are not effluent limits. Okay, so if you exceed the benchmark, it's not a permit violation, it's not a limit, but it's supposed to inform how well your facility is doing at reducing pollutants in your discharge. It should give you an idea if your best management practices are working well. Maybe you need to change things up at the facility if you're exceeding those benchmark values. So because they're not effluent limits, they are going to appear in Net DMR as an alert. meaning if your benchmark was TSS of 50 milligrams per liter and you went in and reported 56 milligrams per liter was your annual average, you're not going to get any kind of compliance flag for exceeding the benchmark value because it's just an alert. So that's what that is, and that's how we've set it up in the system to distinguish between it being not a real effluent limit. There is a waiver option available from benchmark monitoring only during year 3 and 4 of the master general permit cycle. So I mentioned on the very first slide that we issued this permit in August of 2021 and it won't expire until August 2026. So if you perform your monitoring for the first 2 monitoring periods of the general permit cycle and you never exceed those benchmark values, you have an opportunity to waive out of your monitoring requirements for year 3 and 4 of the permit cycle. And if that's the case, you wouldn't be required then to be reporting your benchmark values in Net DMR, but you could, again, use that no data indicator code to specify that you weren't required to conduct that sampling because you're implementing that waiver. And then just a reminder, I know this causes some confusion for everyone. There is no requirement to do benchmark monitoring during the 5th and final year of the general permit cycle. And that's really because of how the monitoring periods follow a calendar year schedule, but the general permit itself is issued in August of every year. And so it just makes it a little bit more challenging to keep up with the different timelines. And so for that reason, there's just no requirement to do the benchmark monitoring in year 5. And actually here on this slide, we've sort of explained following this permit cycle, if you applied during our renewal period, this is what the sampling requirements would look like for you. So you wouldn't have been required to conduct sampling during the 5th and final year of that previous permit cycle. So meaning there's no sampling required until this calendar year. So starting in January of 2022, that's when our permittees would start doing that benchmark sampling and collecting those 2 samples between January and June and then July and December, meaning the first time you're really having to report your benchmark monitoring is this coming March. So you have until December of this year to collect that second sample, and then you'll be reporting your average to us in the Net DMR system in March. And so then year 2 of the permit cycle is going to be this January to December of 2023. And then year 3 would be the 2024 calendar year, year 5 being the 2025 calendar year, year 4 being the 2025, and then year 5 is that renewal period, right? So it's getting cut off in August whenever we actually renew the permit. So there's no benchmark sampling required during that time period. So here's an example of how that benchmark monitoring can appear in the general permit. For example, there's quite a few requirements in Sector C. So if, for example, you had a facility with SIC code 2821, you have plastics and synthetic resins, you would have to sample and report for benchmark on zinc, total zinc. So the benchmark value would be 0.16 milligrams per liter. So you would be sampling, trying to make sure that your best management practices are working well enough to meet that benchmark value of 0.16 milligrams per liter. And if you did happen to exceed, again, benchmarks aren't a limit, so they're just supposed to inform how well your facility is performing at preventing pollutants from discharging. And so that's just going to help you evaluate your facility and see where things can be improved. And then you would report in Net DMR what your annual average would be for that parameter. Okay, our final type of monitoring is impaired waters and pollutants of concern monitoring. So this only applies to certain facilities that are discharging directly into an impaired water body. And by impaired, we mean It is a water body that TCEQ has identified is in poor health. There's too much of one pollutant type impacting that water body, and so they're marking it as impaired. And then that means that our facilities have to do a little bit more to make sure that their discharges aren't further harming that water body. So on the notice of intent or the application that our permittees submit, there is a question that asks if the facility discharges a pollutant of concern at a level of concern. So if, for example, your facility discharges to a water body that has a impairment for nickel, but you don't do anything with nickel. Your facility doesn't discharge any nickel. There's no reason to believe that your facility is discharging nickel at a level of concern for that water body. You would have marked no on that question on the notice of intent, which means that this wouldn't apply to you. But if you are discharging nickel at some elevated level, then you would mark, okay, so we are discharging nickel at a level of concern. And that's going to trigger you to conduct some additional monitoring and reporting. So the pollutant of concern is basically just that parameter that the water body is impaired for. So in my example, it was nickel. There's another example here. It could be something like dissolved oxygen, in which case the parameter that you'd be sampling would really be something like biochemical oxygen demand or chemical oxygen demand. And this type of monitoring requires just one sample to be collected and analyzed by December 31st of each year, and then of course reported by the following March. And these are set up in Net DMR as an unscheduled limit, which just means the system's not flagging whether or not you're reporting it. It's going in that unscheduled limit set, which again, you'll see whenever ASA kind of gives us a look inside Net DMR and the difference between scheduled and unscheduled. And this monitoring requirement is report only, so we don't have a specific limit. You're just supposed to be sampling for this pollutant of concern and then reporting to TCEQ what those levels are. So this is just another example to drive home what we mean by discharging to an impaired water body. So if, for example, the permittee was discharging to segment number 1113, that segment has a TMDL, or a total maximum daily load for bacteria. That's a kind of impairment. It's the worst impairment there is if there's a total maximum daily load. You know, we have grave concern for the health of this water body because there's too much bacteria. And if the permittee determines that, oh, I am discharging bacteria at a level of concern for this water body, then that permittee would be required to monitor for E. coli once per year and report that to TCEQ. So this is a quick summary of kind of what we just talked through with the different monitoring types. So the first one was hazardous metals. And like I said, those are going to go in the limit set type of unscheduled. So that just means, again, because you're only reporting hazardous metals when there's an exceedance, we're using that unscheduled to make sure that the system isn't flagging you for not reporting something. And season ID is 0 for this one, and I'll explain why the season ID matters in just a second. And then you'll notice that the reporting due date for all of the monitoring is March 31st annually. So then there's sector-specific numeric effluent limits. So those are those ones that are coming from the federal rules. We often call them ELGs, for effluent limitations guidelines. For the vast majority of these, they're going to show up in Net DMR as a scheduled limit because you're required to sample and report it no matter what happens, whether you exceed or not, you have to tell us about it. So for the most part, those are going to be scheduled. There are a few cases where if you take multiple samples in 1 month, you have to tell us about the daily average, but you only have to do that if you take more samples. So in those cases, that might appear as unscheduled because we don't know if you're going to take more samples, right? So you can only tell us about it when that actually happens. So that's why those are going to show up in the unscheduled limit set. And those also will have a season ID of 0. And then benchmark monitoring, again, it's going to show up in our unscheduled system or limit set type. And these are going to have a season ID of 1. So the purpose of the season ID is really just to try and distinguish for you in the system and for us in the system to make it really easy to identify which parameters you're seeing are your benchmarks. So if you see that season ID of 1 in the system, you know that that particular parameter is your benchmark that you're reporting for. And then the impaired water body and pollutant of concern, again, those are going to show up as unscheduled with a season ID of 0, just because they're not the benchmark. The purpose of the season ID is just to help you find your benchmarks and make it really obvious to you which ones are your benchmarks. Okay, so now that we've gone over the monitoring types, we'll just dive into some examples. So the monitoring data has to go through the Net DMR system. It's available right now. That's why we're having this wonderful webinar, to hopefully help everyone understand the system. And basically what shows up in Net DMR is based on some of these additional questions that we had to add to our applications. So now you have to tell us if you're implementing waivers from either your hazardous metals or your benchmarks. Meaning if you didn't tell us on your application that you're implementing a waiver, Net DMR doesn't know you're implementing a waiver. So you've got to go in and let us know when that happens by submitting a notice of change. If your facility becomes inactive, in the past, you would just write us a letter and let us know, and then you'd keep record of that, and that would be, you know, your opportunity to then kind of go to the reduced monitoring and inspection frequencies in the permit. But now, if that's the case, we need to let Net DMR know. So to do that, you have to submit a notice of change again, letting us know whenever you go into inactive and active status. And then we need detailed outfall information in order to tell Net DMR, you know, are you discharging to saltwater or freshwater and that kind of stuff. So we have to have that detailed information through the application and all of that be correct in order for Net DMR to have the right information for you all to report. So, for example, in this permit, the TXR 05 EY46, this is how they answered some of those specific questions in the notice of intent. They identified that they are in Sector D with primary SIC code 2951. They identified that they are subject to the federal effluent limitations in 443 subpart A. They discharge to freshwater. They don't discharge that pollutant of concern, and they're not implementing a waiver from hazardous metals, and their facility is active. So then based on these responses, we can then tell what should be showing up in Net DMR for them. So since they're not implementing a hazardous metals waiver, then every one of those hazardous metals will show up in their unscheduled limit set for them to be able to report when there's an exceedance. They did identify that they are subject to those federal effluent limitations guidelines, or the ELGs. So if you look in the permit at the item that they identified, 40 CFR Part 443, this is for our Sector D facilities that are discharging from asphalt emulsion manufacturing production areas. So that just means that basically this table from the permit is what is going to be in their Net DMR and their scheduled limit sets. So they have to report for TSS, oil and grease, and pH every year. So hazardous metals and the ELGs are both going to appear in Net DMR for this facility. Because they identify that they're in Sector D with an SIC code of 2951, there are benchmark requirements for that particular SIC code. So if you look in the permit, you'll see SIC code 2951 has to do benchmark monitoring for TSS. So that's going to appear in their unscheduled limit set as well for reporting of that value. For another example, and this is a good example of those facilities that are co-located activities, meaning they're doing more than one kind of thing at their facility, so they're subject to more requirements. So in this one, TXR 05CW68, they identified themselves in 3 sectors, C, D, and N. Their primary code is 5093, and they have secondary codes of 2874 and 2999. So they're doing 3 different industrial activities within 3 different sectors. So this one's going to have a lot more nuances and information that appears in the Net DMR system. They did identify that they were subject to 2 different effluent limitation guidelines. Part 418 subpart A within sector C, because they have discharges from their phosphate fertilizer manufacturing activities. And then part 443 subpart A, just like the last example, they have discharges from asphalt emulsion manufacturing. They're discharging to freshwater, and then they are discharging a pollutant of concern in this example. So they're discharging dissolved oxygen. And so those monitoring parameters would be the biochemical oxygen demand and chemical oxygen demand. They indicated that they're not implementing a hazardous waiver and that their facility is active. So basically every single monitoring type is going to apply to this facility. So just like the last one, they're not implementing a waiver from hazardous metals. So all of those hazardous metals are going to show up in their unscheduled limit set, and it'll give them the limits based on their freshwater discharge. They reported 2 different effluent limitation guidelines, one from sector C for that phosphate fertilizer manufacturing. So that means they're going to see in their scheduled limit set total phosphorus and fluoride as things that they have to monitor and report. And before I said that these pretty much only show up in scheduled for the ELGs, but in some cases they might be both scheduled and unscheduled. And so in this example, the daily average monitoring only has to be reported if they're collecting more than 1 sample in a calendar month. And since we don't know when that's going to happen, we have to have it in the system as unscheduled so that whenever it does happen, you can go there and report it, and you're not going to be flagged every time, you know, a year goes by that you haven't reported a daily average. So in this case, they're going to appear in both. The daily average will go in the unscheduled limit set, and the daily max will go in the scheduled limit set. The second effluent limitation guideline is going to be set up the same way. So again, it's that sector D one for discharging from asphalt emulsion manufacturing production areas. So there's going to be both scheduled and unscheduled, because just like before, that daily average only has to be reported if you're collecting more than 1 sample in a calendar month. And so that means the daily average will show up in the unscheduled limit set, while the daily max will show up in the scheduled limit set. And if you recall, they had listed 3 different SIC codes in their application. So the first SIC code of 2874 does have benchmark monitoring, specifically for nitrate plus nitrate in, total lead, total iron, total zinc, phosphorus, and TSS. So all of those items or parameters are going to be appearing in their unscheduled limit set to report on. They also identified that they were SIC code 2999 under sector D, and there are no benchmarks for that SIC code. So that particular activity isn't going to translate into any benchmark monitoring within the Net DMR system. And then for their third SIC code of 5093, which is under sector N, there are some benchmarks for that. So they're going to see total copper, total aluminum, total iron, total lead, total zinc, PSS, and chemical oxygen demand in that unscheduled limit set. So when there are duplicates between the different SIC codes, so for example, 2874 has some of the same benchmark requirements that 5093 has, it's not going to be listed twice. So you won't have, I've already forgotten which, the TSS. So like TSS isn't going to appear 2 times in the system unless those limits were different or the benchmark values were different. So they also indicated that they are discharging a pollutant of concern at a level of concern, which means that they're going to have to do reporting of the biochemical oxygen demand and chemical oxygen demand in their unscheduled limit set. So those parameters will appear there. And again, there's not a limit. They're just reporting what the sample results are in the Net DMR system. Unscheduled limit sets in the Net DMR system are pretty unique. They're not used very widely, but the multi-sector general permit is just a lot more complicated and nuanced than a lot of individual permits. And so because of that, the unscheduled DMRs make a lot of sense for our varying schedules, and because we only want you to report some things whenever there's an exceedance. So a lot of the monitoring is done in the unscheduled DMRs, and we know that that's going to be new for many of our permittees. So there's some great information available online to learn about the unscheduled DMRs at the support portal. There's a link available in the slides for you to go to it. And just to assist all of you, before you go into the Net DMR system, you might find it helpful to look back at the permit. Make sure you're familiar with all of your different monitoring requirements, when they're reported and when they're not. And then also look back and see, what did you tell us on your application and your notice of intent? Did you tell us you were implementing a waiver or not? And those kinds of things to figure out what should be appearing for you in the Net DMR system and what you're actually expected to be telling us about. So we've put together a couple of worksheets and tables on the next few slides that you could use to kind of check back and prepare the information for yourself. So if you wanted to look back at what you identified in your application and take note of things like your sector, what SIC codes you indicated, if you said that you're subject to federal effluent guidelines, if you said you're implementing a waiver from benchmark monitoring, and so on. So these are kind of the same questions we used for our examples before, but it could be useful for you to go back and look at your application and kind of refresh your memory on how these things were answered so that you know what should be showing up in the Net DMR system. And then making sure you know what to look at in the Net DMR system. So for example, if you are needing to report your hazardous metals because you had an exceedance, you should know that those are going to be unscheduled. So you're going to have to go to the unscheduled limit set to report those. So this is a quick summary of the different sampling types and, a refresher on what those are. And so then you can ask yourself, am I required to report any of these kinds? And that will help you know where to go in the Net DMR system and what to work from. So for example, maybe I know that I should have nitrate as a benchmark sampling, and so I know that that's going to be showing up in my unscheduled limit set for my outfall, 001. Or maybe I have phosphorus as both a benchmark and an ELG. So I'm going to have to go to two places. I'm going to have to go to the unscheduled and report my annual average for my benchmark. And then I'm going to have to go to my scheduled limit set to report my federal effluent limit. So this is a quick look at the stormwater team. Since we're doing this virtually, you can put some names to faces. Like I said, I myself am permit writer, Michaela Coleman. We have 4 other permit writers, Jesse, Monica, Madison, and Dante. They are all a great help. And if you were to call any of us, we'd be happy to talk through some of these monitoring requirements and help you decipher this information. And then, of course, we have our team leader, Rebecca Alba, who is on the webinar today to help with answering some questions. And then we have within the stormwater team what we call the Stormwater Processing Center, or the SWPC. So we have two great people in there, Autumn and Carol, who can assist you with applications, getting through the STEER system to submit those notice of changes. Maybe this webinar helped you realize that you need to go back and update some information. And if that's the case, they're going to be a great resource to assist you in that process. And here is our contact information. So if you have questions about the actual permit language or what requirements apply to you, the technical team, the stormwater team, is who you want to reach out to. So we are available by phone at 512-239-4671, or you can email us at swgp@tceq.texas.gov. And following this webinar, if you have questions that we don't get to, you are more than welcome to use that email to come back to us and ask us your questions. And then I mentioned the Stormwater Processing Center. They process applications and help our customers get through our CRZ permitting system. And so if you need any assistance with that, you can reach them at that 3700 phone number, or they have their own mailbox, swpermit@tceq.texas.gov. And so with that, now I think we can take some questions.
All right, thank you, Michaela. As a reminder, y'all, this webinar is being recorded and it will be published to the TCEQ's YouTube channel and web pages at a later date. And now we will go ahead and answer a few of these questions for a few minutes. So our first question is, do you have to do hazardous metals testing in the same year you obtain coverage, or only starting in your first full year of coverage?
Great question. So this depends a little bit on when you obtain coverage. So the general permit requires sampling of hazardous metals to be conducted if you have at least one full quarter of permit coverage. If you have one full quarter in that calendar year, we would expect you to sample and report if you have a discharge. And if you don't have a discharge, you would just report no discharge. But if you obtained it too late in the year, there's not a full quarter left, then it wouldn't begin until the following calendar year.
Okay. And then the next question, please clarify if hazardous metals monitoring is required in the first and last years of the permit when neither year is a full calendar year. They are referencing 2021 and 2026.
Great. Yeah, so that's kind of similar to the last question. It depends on when you obtain your permit for that first year. If you do your renewal or obtain your coverage before, while there's still a full quarter left, then you would be expected to do the monitoring and reporting. And the same is true for year 5 of the permit cycle. So it's not like benchmarks. You have, the full calendar year, you're not required to be collecting 2 samples in 2 time windows. So if there's a full quarter of you having coverage, we would expect you to collect a sample and report.
Okay. Next question. My facility completed a heavy metals waiver. Do we still have to take that one sample and have it analyzed, or would we just have to go into the Net DMR and submit NOTI for each year?
So if you completed a waiver, it depends a little bit on what your waiver is for. For example, the waiver option lets you use it, maybe for a single outfall or for a single metal. But if you were waiving out of all of the metals for all of your outfalls, you would not be required to collect a sample and analyze it. I will say, and I think Asa will talk about this in his portion of the presentation, because hazardous metals and benchmarks and other things are all going to appear in the unscheduled limit set, if you go in there to report benchmarks, if you haven't told us that you're no longer doing hazardous metals, you might see the hazardous metals line there. And if that's the case, then you'll want to use a NOTI code so it doesn't look like you're just failing to report something. But you shouldn't have to report anything if you've successfully told us through your notice of change that you're not doing the hazardous metal sampling because you've waived out of it. I hope that was clear.
Okay. Next question, if benchmarks are exceeded, who gets the alerts from Net DMR?
So alert is just the term we use for something different than a limit. So we're not getting alerted to anything whenever you're submitting that. We'll have to run reports to determine who's maybe exceeded their benchmark values. So it's not going into like the compliance software system, because again, they're not limits, right? They're just values. They're there to inform you as the permittee to evaluate your own facility. So there's not going to be any kind of a flag in the system or note that you've exceeded that value.
Okay, great. Let's do one more before taking a break. Will the NOI application be revised, or is it already equipped for the questions, comments discussed pertaining to the Net DMR reporting?
Great question. So it is already equipped with these questions. So if you've submitted an application since we did the renewal back in August, those questions were already there. If any of the information changes, you can submit a notice of change to update it. So those questions are already there. And if you look at your most recent application, you'll be able to see how you answered all of those.
Okay, great. All right, let's see. Okay, so to clarify on reporting for hazardous metals, if reporting is not required for hazardous metals because a facility did not exceed, is a NOTI code used or is no entry required?
Good question. So it depends a little bit on if you submitted in your notice of intent or your notice of change that you're implementing a waiver from all of the hazardous metals, then they shouldn't appear at all in the Net DMR system. If you didn't do that, but you are implementing the waiver or you just didn't exceed, so you'll go into the unscheduled limit set, and if the only thing in there the only thing in your unscheduled limit set is hazardous metals, so like if you don't have benchmark monitoring requirements or any of those effluent limitation guidelines that show up as an unscheduled limit, then nothing has to be reported. However, if you do have other things in your unscheduled limit set that you need to report on, like your benchmarks, the hazardous metals are still going to show up there, and it won't let you submit it as a blank. So as long as you're in the Net DMR system looking at your unscheduled limit set, you're reporting your benchmarks, you're going to see the lines for your hazardous metals. And in order for you to submit that full limit set, you'll have to put in a NOTI code for those. But if the hazardous metals are the only thing in there, you don't have to ever go into the unscheduled limit set and report anything. I hope that that makes sense. It's a little confusing, and hopefully it'll be more clear whenever you actually see the screen during ACE's presentation. So you only need to use that NOTI code if you're trying to report other things in your unscheduled limit set, but you don't have any hazardous metals to report. You'll use that NOTI code instead of just leaving it blank in a submission.
Okay. What is discharging directly to an impaired water body? Literally directly or through a series of ditches and channels that ultimately discharge to the impaired water body?
It's more literally directly. So it could be, your outfall going directly into the water body. If you own the ditches and channels, that's just part of your discharge system into the water body. That could be considered directly. But indirectly would be like if you're discharging to like a county-owned ditch that eventually reaches the water body, or if you discharge to a municipal separate storm sewer system, that would be an indirect discharge. If you want, feel free to call or email us and kind of describe your specific situation, and we could provide some more specific guidance for you.
Okay, great. Okay, what if you only get one benchmark sample during a reporting year?
If you only get one, then you'll just report that one result in your benchmark monitoring.
Okay. All right. So if you don't exceed the annual metals and you don't have ELGs, you do not need to report to Net DMR. Is that the correct interpretation?
It could be. It depends on if you have benchmark monitoring. Again, there's so many different types of monitoring, and some are in unscheduled and some are in scheduled. So it's really beneficial to to write out exactly what monitoring applies to you and sort out which ones are showing up in unscheduled and which ones are showing up in scheduled. So if you don't have any exceedances and that's the only thing in your unscheduled limit set, then no, you don't have to report those in Net DMR. But if you have other things in your unscheduled limit set that you do need to report, then you still need to go into the Net DMR system and report those and use NODI codes for those hazardous metals that don't require a reporting.
Okay. And will we not need to send in paper reports anymore?
That is correct. So the permit requires the use of Net DMR. We did have, a little delay getting the system set up, but now that it's available, there are no more paper reports being submitted. They all need to be through the Net DMR system.
Okay, awesome. If we submit an NOC to add an outfall, when will the new outfall appear in Net DMR?
That's a good question. So there is going to be a small delay because we kind of have to manually send that information to the Net DMR system. I don't know exactly what the time delay is, but I can find out.
Okay, awesome. Okay, and this person says, I have 2 permits for the MSGP. I looked at Net DMR and one permit has DMRs loaded, but the other one shows no DMRs. Are all DMRs supposed to be there?
That's also a great question. So the vast majority should be in there, depending on when you submitted the application. If it was more recently, it might take just a little delay for it to show up. Feel free to reach out to us specifically and tell us those permit numbers and we can take a look and let you know if there's an issue or if it should be appearing there.
Okay, great. What if there were no qualified rain events during the calendar year? Is there anything I need to do in the DMR report?
Great question. So if you have any scheduled limit sets, so like your ELGs or pretty much just your effluent limitation guidelines, the system's going to flag you for saying nothing. So you do have to come in and do the NODI code, basically saying that there was no discharge or no requirement to sample. So in that scenario, you would have to submit something, but not too many of our permittees are subject to those ELGs. So if everything that you are expected to be reporting is in the unscheduled limit set and you don't have anything qualifying, then you don't have to go into Net DMR.
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and do one more question. So this attendee said, you talked about submitting an application and telling what the DMR needs to know about your facility. Do we need to submit a new application or will the DMR come from my facility permit that I have now?
Excellent question. So it should come from whatever you submitted at the time that you applied. So like we had the question earlier, if those questions were already set up, and the answer is that they are. So whatever application you submitted, you should have already informed us of that information through it. If anything has changed, though, you might need to go in and update it and submit a notice of change. But it should already have flowed into our Net DMR system and represent your facility as you represented it on the application.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Michaela. All right, now we're going to go ahead and get started with our part 2 of the presentation with Asa Bigham.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
You sound good.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to be sharing the Net DMR portion of this MSGP presentation. So the intent of this presentation is to provide the MSGP permittees with information on how to use the Net DMR system to report electronically successfully and to help the MSGP permittees better understand their reporting requirements overall. So the first thing that you're going to need to do in order to start reporting in Net DMR is to have access to your permit. So the first thing that you'll need to do is you'll need to log into Net DMR through your CDX account. If you don't already have a CDX account, there are steps available online to show you how to get set up with that. But for our intents and purposes, we'll just be going over the Net DMR portion. So you'll need to sign in to your CDX account. You'll enter your user ID and password in those fields. And then from there, it'll take you to the CDX Net DMR portal. So once you've logged into CDX, you will then need to select your role in the Net DMR Texas program area. And if you don't already have access to it, you'll have to click on the Add Program Service button. And for the program service name, make sure that you are selecting the NDMR TX Net DMR Texas TCEQ. And then you'll select your role. And that will take you into Net DMR. So here are some of the CDX user types and their roles in Net DMR, what they're able to do. So on the first one is the permittee signature. So this is going to be a role that you want if you work for the company and you will be signing and submitting DMRs. This will give you the signatory, the permit administrator, and the edit and view role. So the definition is a person who is authorized to sign, view, edit, and submit DMRs for a specific permit. You will also be able to approve roles for others, except signatory roles. And if you're unsure whether or not you would qualify as a signatory authority, there is Regulatory Guideline 557 that sort of gives a definition. So if you're unsure of that, you can just do a quick Google search for that TCEQ, and it should give you the definition. There's also a permittee no signature role, which essentially has every bit of functionality that the signature has, except you're not able to sign and submit DMRs. And then there is a role of a data provider. And so that's going to be like if you are with a lab, you're a contractor or a third-party affiliate. And this will give you the ability to view, enter, and import DMRs and edit cores, but you will not be able to sign and submit forms. So once you have selected your role in NetDMR, it will take you to this NetDMR portal that will just have some, a welcome, some quick updates, and you'll just need to click on the Continue to NetDMR button, which will take you inside NetDMR. So this is going to be the NetDMR homepage. From this page, you will need to request access to your permit before you can begin submitting. So you'll click on the button at the very top of the page. It's the third tab over that says Request Access. So this will take you to this Request Access tab, and this is where you'll need to first enter in your permit number. So you'll enter in your permit number next to the ID, and then you'll hit the Update button. Once you hit the Update button, it should fill out the facility name. And then from there, you'll need to select the role that you signed up for. And then once you select the role, you'll hit the Add Request button. Once you have hit the Add Request button, it should pull up a summary of your request so you can make sure that the permit ID, the facility name, everything is looking correct. And once you've verified that, you will click on the Submit button. So if you have a signatory role, after you hit that submit button, there will be some additional information required. The first thing that you'll need to select is what is your relationship to the facility. And there are going to be two options. The option number one is a parent. And so that is if you work at a corporate headquarters or an offsite office. And then there is facility, and you'll select that if you either work on site or are near the location of the facility. Then you will additionally also have to specify whether you are a responsible official, or if you're not a responsible official, you'll click on the button below and you will enter in the information of who the responsible official is. And once you fill that out, you'll hit the submit button at the bottom. And from here, you will have the availability to select either sign electronically or sign via paper. So if you sign electronically, you will be taken to this screen where you can view a copy of your subscriber agreement and click Sign electronically when you are ready to officially submit your request for approval. Signing electronically is going to be the faster way to get access. You'll typically get access the same day that you submit the request. So it is recommended that you do it that way. So you'll have to sign electronically, and then if you choose to sign via paper, you'll be taken to a very similar screen. It'll have the copy of your subscriber agreement, and then it will have the address of where you need to send your record to. So you'll print off the subscriber agreement, you'll sign it, and then you'll mail it to the address listed. So next we're going to be going over searching and submitting DMRs, some of the MSGP monitoring requirements, and how to search for and submit DMRs. So this was a slide that Michaela shared previously in her presentation. It's just going to be going over some of those monitoring types, the limit sets, and their due dates. So one thing that's important to note that Michaela talked about is the benchmark monitoring. So if you look under the season ID column, you'll see that the benchmark is the only one that's going to have a season ID of 1. So it's important to take note of that whenever you're looking at the unscheduled, because there is a possibility that there might be duplicate parameters based on what your how you submitted your NOI. And so you'll want to make sure that you're noticing the season 1. That will be for the benchmark monitoring. So to search for DMRs, this is going to be for searching for scheduled DMRs. So this will apply if you have those ELGs, those federal effluent limits. A good way to do that is to, on the home page of Net DMR, you'll make sure that you're selecting the permit ID for what you're wanting to submit for. And then you'll scroll down a little bit further on the page, and it'll you can search by DMR due date. So these the scheduled DMRs are going to be due annually in March. So you'll just want to select March and then the year that you're submitting for. And then you'll hit the search button at the bottom of the page. So once you've hit the search button, this will be your search results, and this is going to bring up a DMR's. This is going to bring up the DMR that has a scheduled due date of March 31st. So this will only be for the scheduled DMRs. So this will sort of give you a summary of the discharge number. So you can see that there, the monitoring period end date, which you can see there, December 31st, 2021. It'll show you the DMR due date, March 31st, 2022, and then it'll also show you the status of the DMR. So this DMR is currently in the ready for data entry status. So in the previous slide, we talked about the outfall and the discharge number and name. So this is just to sort of explain what you're looking at. So the first one will be the outfall number. So if you have multiple outfalls, they'll each be there by their number. Then the letter after that represents the if it's scheduled or unscheduled. So if you see an S, that'll be for the scheduled DMRs, a U for unscheduled DMRs. And then at the very end, that last letter represents the frequency of the DMR. So the letter there, Y, would stand for annual. You might also see an S for semi-annually, a Q for quarterly, and then there also are A for monthly. So to get inside the DMR, you'll want to select from the drop-down box on the far left side, Edit DMR, and then you'll click on the Go button, and that will take you inside the DMR itself. So when you first are in the DMR, it'll bring up this top of the page, which is just a DMR summary. So you can make sure that all the information looks correct, all the stuff that you're looking for there. And then from there, you can look below and you'll see where your different parameters are. So everything on the far left column, those will be each of the individual parameters. And then further to the right where it says quality or concentration, and it has the two values, that's where you'll need to enter in the actual values of what you're reporting. So one thing that we can notice in this DMR is if you look at the second parameter down, the 00530, the total suspended solids, if you look at that season ID, you'll see that the season is 1, and so that indicates that this would be a benchmark reporting. So you can see that there, that's season 1. So once you're going into the actual data entry, you'll need to go in and enter the values. And if you see that season 1, if you look over at the value, it's saying a maximum, but all of the benchmark reporting is just going to be an average. So even if you see that word maximum, if you're reporting benchmark, you'll need to understand that that basically is just asking for your average reporting. And then to the further right side, you'll also see the frequency of analysis. So if you're submitting something for annual reporting, you can select the 01/YR for annual. And you can click on the list button that will bring up all the different types that you can look at. But let's say that you're entering in a value and you exceed the limits. So let's say this is one of the ELGs and you are exceeding a limit. Net DMR will bring up an acknowledge button. It's just wanting you to make sure that you didn't incorrectly enter in a number you didn't mean to, and you'll have to acknowledge it before you're able to continue on and before you submit the DMR. So I mentioned earlier, those are the frequency of analysis and sample types. You can click on the list and it'll pull up everything that's available. The annual is probably going to be what a lot of you guys are using primarily. And then there's a bunch of different sample types for you to choose as well. So once you have entered in all your DMR data, you will need to scroll to the bottom of the page and click on either Save and Continue or Save and Exit. Depending on if you click Save and Continue or Save and Exit, the monitoring status of the DMR will be updated to Net DMR Validated, and you can see that there just on the different screens of how it will appear to you based on what you clicked on. And so yeah, there's that. And then once you've saved your DMR, you'll want to click on the Sign and Submit button. That's if you have the signatory authority. So once you click on Sign and Submit, you will have to enter in your password. So you'll enter that in there, and then you'll click on the Submit button. You'll enter in there might be a question that pops up, one of the questions that you would have created whenever you were creating your account. So you'll answer that and hit submit. And then that will be the confirmation page. So if everything went correctly, you'll get this signing process confirmation, and you'll also get an email confirmation that NetDMR has received your submission. And then shortly after, you should receive an email that indicates that your DMR has been successfully processed and the data has been submitted. This email will also include a CDX transaction ID that you can see. So now a lot of the DMRs, or a lot of what you might need to do, are unscheduled DMRs. So to start, you're going to want to click on the Unscheduled DMRs button at the top of the NetDMR homepage. And once you click on that, it will pull up the search page. So from there, you'll need to enter in your permit ID and click on the Update button. Then you will need to select the permitted feature, the limit set, and the monitoring period end date that you're submitting for, and then you'll click on the Submit button. So like Michaela mentioned previously, there might be an instance that you're going into an unscheduled DMR to submit an exceedance of some kind, but because the unscheduled DMR is going to be pulling up all of the parameters that are associated, you're going to want to use a NODI code for the ones that you don't have data or don't need to report for. So the NODI codes that you most likely are going to use will either be the NODI equals C, which represents no discharge, and then there is the NODI equals 9, which is conditional monitoring not required this period. So if you have a bunch of parameters that are on your DMR, instead of going through and individually selecting each of them, at the top of the DMR, you can select a NODI code, and this will fill out all the parameters with that NODI code. And then if you just have one parameter that you're needing to report for, you can go down to the NODI for that individual parameter and deselect it and then enter in your data. But if there are just a few that you don't need to submit for, or you need to submit a NODI code for, you can go down to each of those individual parameters and drop down and select that NODI code. So it's important to note that a DMR cannot be submitted with blank values. So you're either going to have a value in that parameter slot, or you're going to need to have a NODI code selected for that parameter in order for the DMR to be submitted. So this is our contact information. If you have any questions, you can contact us at the email at netdmr@tceq.texas.gov. And then there's also an MSGP phone line where we can be reached at the number below. And that is about it.
All right, thank you very much, Asa. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started with some more questions, but first I wanted to remind y'all, if you have not filled out the attendance form, please do so. It is up at the top of the chat, and then in just a moment, I am going to get the survey link posted in the chat, so let me go ahead and do that for y'all. All right, the survey link is posted to the channel and the Q&A box. And now we're going to go ahead and start with some questions. How does reporting for a representative outfall work?
I can answer that one. This is Michaela with the stormwater team. So the permit does allow for certain kinds of monitoring. You can designate a representative outfall. For example, maybe you have 3 outfalls, but outfall 001 is considered representative. As long as you have that documentation on site to describe your representative outfall, you would then only be doing your reporting on that one outfall, and the other outfalls you could put a NODI code like that NODI code 9 conditional not required this monitoring period because you're implementing that representative outfall.
Okay. When will the unscheduled DMRs be available online?
I can answer that one too. So they should be available online right now, as long as you have, an active permit with us. Like we said earlier, if you've applied more recently, there might be a smaller delay between when it's going to show up in the Net DMR system, because we are having to kind of flow the application data to the Net DMR system in batches. So there could be a small delay, but if you've had your permit for a while, you should be able to see that information in Net DMR once you set up your account.
All right. Okay. This is a question for the Net DMR system. They tried adding it to the CDX account, but there is not a way to click on it. Will that become available later?
Hi, this is Danielle. I'm with the compliance monitoring team in the Net DMR helpline. I'm not real sure what they're asking in that question. If they're trying to add it to their CDX, they won't be able to add their TX number in the CDX portion of the application. As Asa outlined in his presentation, you actually have to navigate over to the Net DMR system by clicking on your CDX role, and that's where you're going to add your actual facility ID to your account. So you won't find that information in CDX. I hope that answers that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Danielle. And if that, if there needs to be more clarifying for that question, feel free to go ahead and respond to us in the Q&A box again, and we'll be happy to go over it. The second part of the question, for the DMR at the schedule showed, for the DMR renewal that was completed for 2021 to 2022, some facilities were sent a waiver that lasted until April of 2022. Does this mean that we will only be required for one sample this year to be submitted to the DMR?
I can speak to that, Michaela, again with the stormwater team. So that waiver was just for the reporting that was due in March 31, 2022. So the reporting that's going to be due March 31, 2023, which covers this calendar year, January to December of 2022, you don't have a waiver from that. You're still required to monitor and report. And just to clarify, that waiver wasn't a waiver from monitoring, it was a waiver from reporting in the Net DMR system. So you should have submitted that on paper to us and kept documentation on site, but you would be required to report any of your sampling data from this calendar year in the Net DMR system by March 31 of 2023.
Okay, awesome. Next question, is the Net DMR a part of STEERS or another website?
This is Danielle again with compliance monitoring. It's a completely separate website. It's actually a federal website, and you're going to actually start out at cdx.epa.com always, because you're going to start at the CDX portal in order to navigate over to our Net DMR website. So it's always going to start out with that cdx.epa.gov website first.
Okay, great, thank you. If you are required to take samples once a year on the 12 metals and you have no exceedance, do you need a CDX account and do you need to complete the Net DMR?
I can try.
Go ahead, Michaela.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, so it depends. Again, if you're saying that your only monitoring requirement is for those hazardous metals and you're implementing a waiver from every hazardous metals from every outfall, then there's really nothing to report. So there's no need to set up the account and go in. But keep in mind, if anything changes at your facility and you're no longer eligible for that waiver, or if you add on a new activity that you need to report to us and start performing additional monitoring, then you would need to come into the Net DMR system and start reporting and provide that information. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to have it set up in case anything changes and you're prepared to use it. Or if you do have an exceedance and you're not implementing a waiver, you'll want to have that account.
Okay. All right, when starting a renewed MSGP permit, can the metals monitoring from the prior permit cycle be used for a waiver in the renewal? Or is monitoring required for the first 2 years with the requirement to file an NOC to waive monitoring in the subsequent years?
That is an excellent question. So whenever the general permit renews, it's like a restart for everyone. So you have to recertify your waiver status with either new monitoring or, new indication that those materials aren't present on site or part of your industrial processes. So you have to kind of go through that certification again in order to implement it in this new permit cycle. And then you would tell us with the notice of change if you didn't accomplish that while you were submitting your renewal application.
Okay. I have completed my sampling to this year and I am ready to submit. When will it show up on my CDX?
This is Danielle with compliance monitoring again. Again, that's gonna depend. As Michaela mentioned, some of these facilities are still being uploaded in batches, but the Net DMR system generally is designed to make your DMR available as soon as your monitoring period begins. So your annual monitoring period is January 1st through December 31st of each year. So in general, your DMR will be available that first day in January because you can do your sampling anytime during that 12-month period.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, next question. We recently renewed our permit. Will we need to submit another NOI in order to access on the Net DMR? We already submit plant effluent there. Will I be able to access?
I can try and tackle the first part of the question. So you don't have to submit a new application. Only one application is required as long as you've submitted it during this general permit cycle, meaning, before or after August 14, 2021, and you have an active permit status, then that information should be available for you in Net DMR to start doing your reporting. As far as having access from other program areas in the Net DMR CDX system, I believe you might still be able to use your existing account, but you're going to have to actually set up your access for the MSGP permit. And maybe Danielle or Asa can add on to that if I said anything incorrectly.
No, that's correct. Each MSGP permit will need a separate, subscriber agreement in order to submit. And if they have a separate individual permit, that's a completely different access request.
Okay. All right, next question. If we have no metals exceedances, do we need to register in Net DMR or just document under threshold on site as we have done in the past?
Great question. So like we've said in response to a couple of other questions, it really depends on if that's your only monitoring requirement. If you don't have benchmarks, you don't have ELGs, you don't have the impaired water bodies monitoring, and you only have hazardous metals monitoring, you only need to go in and tell us if there's an exceedance. If there's not an exceedance, there's no requirement to come in and report anything the same way it has been. You'll just keep that documentation on site. If there is an exceedance, you will have to come in and report that exceedance in the system. And like I said previously, if anything changes at your facility and suddenly other monitoring requirements apply to you, we would be expecting you to go in and report that data.
Okay, great. And then going along off of that question in the similar field, if you have an exceedance in one of the parameters, are you required to report for all? So I'm guessing meaning if you have an exceeding for, say, nickel, are you required to report for the rest of your parameters and metals that do not necessarily exceed?
Yes, so that's a...
Oh, go ahead, Michaela.
Sorry, that's kind of what Asa was alluding to in his presentation, that, those are going to appear in our unscheduled limit set for you, and it should have, the list of all of the metals. And if you exceed only for one, then you have to come in and report for that one. But you don't want to submit that entire DMR with a bunch of blank rows. It won't let you. So what you can do is you'll use a NODI code for the remaining ones with that NODI code. I believe it was 9, conditional monitoring not required this period. And so then you would say, I'm reporting my one exceedance, but the other ones weren't required, so I don't have to report those.
Okay. All right, and when submitting an NOC for outfall information, Net DMR has been changing the outfall numbers. Example, outfall 1 turns to outfall 2. Is there a workaround to this where the outfall number does not get modified if we have to revise other outfall information? Another
great question. Unfortunately, there's no workaround at this time. We're always working to improve the STEERS and e-permit system and trying to change that. I know that that's some feedback we've received for some time. So at this time, there's not a workaround. Unfortunately, they're going to be renumbered every time you update or change and add new information.
Okay. Our next question, when trying to request the access to the permit, I was given the error, a signatory must be approved for this permit before any other roles can be requested. What should I do at that point? It does not let me select a role.
Hi, this is Danielle, Compliance Monitoring. Yes, the Net DMR system is set up like that for a reason. You've got to have a signatory role approved for every single access request first, because that signatory person also gets the permit administrator role in tandem at the same time, because a permit administrator is the one that will be able to approve all edit and view requests that come in for the facility. And TCEQ is only going to report we're only going to approve the signatory requests, but Net DMR is going to demand that you've got a signatory / permit administrator set up first, and then you'll be able to request an edit role or a view role or a permit administrator role at that point. But signatory role always needs to be approved first.
Okay. Next question, what if one of your outfalls is substantially similar to another outfall and is not sampled? How do you report those?
So I think this is similar to the question we received earlier about representative outfalls. So if you're implementing that and you've maintained your documentation on site to demonstrate that one sample is one outfall is representative of your other outfalls, and you're only conducting your sampling at that one outfall, then you will go ahead and report for that one outfall, and then for your other outfalls, you can use a NODI code to indicate that that monitoring wasn't required.
Okay. Next, I'm at a wastewater treatment facility and already have a signed subscriber agreement for other DMRs. Do I need another one for stormwater?
Yes, you will. You will need a signed subscriber agreement for every separate facility TX ID or TXR05 ID that you have. It's separate permissions for each facility, even if they end up on the same subscriber agreement. Like, you can add several stormwater facilities on the same subscriber agreement if you have the same responsible official, but you will still need a separate subscriber agreement for these stormwater permits.
Okay, thank you. Next question, I have already set up my CDX account and have gotten to the spot where you can add the TCEQ Net DMR service. When it asks me to add my organization, I try typing it in and it tells me I cannot find it. Is there a step that I am missing?
This is a snag that gets a lot of people over there. This is a purely informational field in CDX, because as I indicated earlier, you don't link up into your permit until you get into the Net DMR system and you use your permit ID to link up. This is just an organizational field. If you search and you cannot find your organization, there's a link there that says request to add it, and you can just add it and go on through the steps.
Okay, great. Okay, please confirm, when submitting your benchmark average, you would like us to put 01/YR?
This is Danielle. You would probably need to choose another frequency of analysis, which is semi-annual, once every 6 months. I think it's 1/6M is what it comes down to, because you're taking 2 different samples in your 2 different semi-annual benchmark periods. You're reporting once a year, but your sampling frequency is semi-annually, correct, Michaela?
Yes, that's correct. I was going to say the same thing. I was trying to find the right code, but that sounds right. So you're going to
I think
use
it's
the
1/6M, I think is what it is.
Okay, great. Okay, next, so scheduled and unscheduled parameters are submitted separately in the Net DMR system?
Yes, they will be on those different outfall indicators. Like as Asa slide outlined, you'll see like an 001 SY for a scheduled DMR, and then an unscheduled parameter will be named differently. It'll be an 001, for example, UY. So it will be 2 separate outfalls that you will go in there and search for differently and separately in Net DMR.
Okay. The next question, will you be sending a copy of this presentation to all attendees? I'll answer this one. We have the slides posted in the chat. I will go ahead and at the end also do another announcement with the 2 links combined into one chat. So you'll be able to see it right at the bottom. But presentation part 1 slides are the second message up at the top underneath the attendance form link. And then you can find the part 2 slides down in the middle of the Q&A box. It was announced at 10:10, but I'll go ahead and put those in at the end as well. Once we're done with questions, I'll group those together and get it sent in the chat for y'all. Okay, let's look at this next question. Okay, we submitted our NOI but never received a renewed permit. If nothing changed, do we still utilize the previous 5-year permit?
A good question. I guess I'm not sure what exactly you mean by submitting the NOI but not receiving a renewed permit. It could be if maybe you're referring to you missed the renewal window, so you had to submit a new NOI and get a new authorization number. And if that's the case, then you would be using your new authorization number under the current permit. So you shouldn't be utilizing things from the last permit cycle. Everything's new and fresh this year. So hopefully that answered your question and maybe what you were getting at. If not, let me know. You can reach out to me at the swgp@tcq.texas.gov and can try and answer your situation more specifically.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can investigators query the Integrated Compliance and Information System database for entities sample results?
This is Danielle. Yes, they sure can query ISIS, and they can also view cores in Net DMR.
Okay, when entering a NODI code for no discharge, let's say due to no qualifying storm and/or retention pond design, are there documents you need to keep on site for proof, such as rain gauge logs?
Yes, great question. So you definitely want to keep record of this kind of information just to demonstrate that you did complete everything correctly and that there was no way for you to collect a sample and monitor. Just how we did it with the paper DMRs, if you were telling us no discharge on those, you were expected to have documentation and evidence to support that reporting.
Okay, great. For benchmark reporting, what decode must be used, P or C?
I think you might be referring to the NODI code. I'm not sure what the
I believe
question.
it's the NODI code that we're
okay,
talking
yeah. So I guess it depends on what the reason is for you not reporting your benchmarks. If you're implementing a waiver, you could use the NODI code 9, which is the monitoring not required. So not submitting during this monitoring period. Or if there was no discharge, then you can use that NODI code C to indicate that there was no discharge from your facility, so you were unable to collect a sample. If you ever have questions about that as you're filling it out and you have, your description of a reason why, we can try and help you decipher which is the appropriate code, but those are the most common ones.
Okay, next question. If compounds are showing up in the Net DMR that are not part of our permit, do we state this one with a NODI code?
Great question. Do you want to go ahead, Danielle?
Sure. Yeah, that would indicate that maybe your NOI hadn't been filled out properly. So I would say that you would want to get that corrected to where Net DMR is showing all of your compounds, correctly that you're supposed to be testing for. And if you have extra things, you might want to check in to see how your NOI is filled out. What do you think, Michaela?
Yes, I was going to recommend the same thing. So whatever's showing up in Net DMR should be a reflection of what you reported to us based on the permit requirements. If you see something that you don't think belongs to you, take a look at your application and what you submitted, and then kind of compare it to the permit. And if it still appears to you that there's something there that should be, give us a call in permitting, and we can try and look at your application and, with our knowledge of the permit, tell you if it should be there or not. It might be that you need to submit a notice of change to correct something. Maybe you accidentally identified something you didn't mean to, and so that's resulting in a parameter showing up. We're happy to kind of talk through that with you and help you determine that. And then it's best, like Danielle said, to just work on getting it corrected so that you don't have that parameter at all. Because we don't want anyone reporting even a NODI code for something they're not supposed to. So it should be reflecting what you identify on your application.
Okay, thank you, Michaela. All right, so to clarify, if you do benchmark monitoring, then you have to report hazardous metals via DMR, even if the results are under the limit.
This Danielle, yeah, you all of your benchmark and your hazardous metals parameters are going to show up on the same form. But if you're just going to go in there and report your benchmark, you can go in there and identify all of those benchmark parameters and enter your data. Then for all the hazardous metals parameters, you would just use a NODI 9, meaning conditional not required if you didn't have any exceedances to report. Again, the system is going to look for either data or a NODI code and no blanks.
Okay, next question. I know that if I do not exceed any of the metals, I don't need to report. This is effluent metals. If I don't exceed any benchmark values, I also do not need to report anything for benchmark, correct?
So that is incorrect. Everybody who has benchmark monitoring, whether you exceed or not, we expect you to submit your benchmark data each year, at least for those first 2 years of this general permit cycle. You have the option to waiver out later in the permit cycle during years 3 and 4, as I showed in my presentation slides. But the first 2 years, everyone is expected to be submitting data, even if it's a NODI code saying that there wasn't a discharge. So hazardous metals are the only unique one where you don't have to worry about reporting anything to us unless there's an exceedance. The benchmark values we need those numbers from you, even if they're below the benchmark level, because we use that data to change the permit in the future, either raise the benchmark value or lower it. So it's important that we receive that information from our permittees in order for us to actually write the permit with good benchmark values for everyone.
Okay, great. Will you provide a table that shows each monitoring requirement along with the associated code, schedule, etc.?
So we did our best in the presentations to provide that. So if you think something is lacking in the slides and you want some different information, let us know. We're happy to see how we can improve your experience in translating all of this into the Net DMR system. But hopefully what we've included in the presentations will help you with some of that information.
Okay. All right, next question. I have 3 outfalls, but during my last compliance investigation, my inspector stated that I only needed to sample from 1 outfall due to that most of my runoff flows out that 1 outfall. Will the DMR show all 3 of my outfalls, and how will I report the results if I do not sample the other 2 outfalls?
Great question. So, and the example you described, you have the 3 outfalls, but most of your discharge is going out of just the 1 outfall. So in that case, all 3 of your outfalls are going to show up in Net DMR. Every outfall that you indicate on your application gets translated into the DMR system for you to report on. So depending on the situation, so in this case, if you're not really discharging out of outfalls 2 and 3, all of the discharges leaving outfall 1, then outfall 1 is going to have all of your sampling results, and then in 2 and 3, you're just going to report that there was no discharge. So you would do the NODI code saying that there was no discharge from those outfalls. And if it's the case that, you know, under basically any rain event, extreme rain event, those outfalls never discharge, then they may not really be outfalls, because outfalls are supposed to be the point source where the stormwater is actually leaving your facility. But if they really are outfalls and maybe it just takes some extreme rainfall for anything to flow out of those, you would just be reporting that there's no discharge from those outfalls. And then your actual sampling results would be reported on the outfall where you did collect a sample.
Okay, great. All right, so we're coming up on our last few questions. I wanted to remind y'all that these questions are being submitted in the Q&A box. You can hit the question bubble at the top right of your screen to enter that Q&A box. So if you have any questions here at the end, please get those submitted and we'll do our best to answer them. We have some time left, so we should be able to answer them. All right, so this next question is TCEQ sending letters or email notifications to permittee holders about the need to submit net DMRs and not to submit paper forms?
At this time, we don't have plans to send out additional information. It's already stated clearly in the general permit itself that monitoring is required in the net DMR system. The information we sent out to permittees previously was a temporary waiver allowing for the submission of paper, and those have since expired. So all permittees are expected to use the Net DMR system as it's clearly indicated in the general permit.
Also, this is Kristen from Small Business. Whenever we sent out the information about this webinar, we included information about submitting in Net DMR instead of paper. And so if you want to receive email updates, we will send out updates reminding people about the March 31st, 2023 deadline. You can sign up for our emails through Gov Delivery, and I'll include that link in the chat. But yeah, I would recommend that you sign up for our Gov Delivery email so that you get reminders about the Net DMR reporting deadline.
Yes, and Kristen, I went ahead and got that link published underneath the question that was just asked, so y'all can find that in the published live event Q&A box. Okay, awesome. All right, thanks y'all for that info, and let's go. Okay, next question. Our facility applied for hazardous metals waiver in the NOI. However, the unscheduled DMR has fields to complete hazardous metals. Do we use NODI codes 9, or do we need to contact the Net DMR team to remove these fields?
This is Danielle. Yeah, you would just need to use the NODI code 9 to complete those fields and then fill out your benchmark monitoring if you have them. I will add that on every single DMR form when you're in the Net DMR system filling out your data, down towards the bottom, there is a comment section that you guys can always utilize to give us any pertinent information that you need. There's also a way that you can attach information if you've got a letter from your lab or any kind of information, extra information. We always welcome more data than not enough. So the comment section is your friend. You can always put in there that you indicate that you have a hazardous metals waiver. Yeah, use those fields that are given to you for the extra information.
Okay, thank you. All right. Our next question, during construction, do we need to change the outfall location? If so, how do we do that? Or is the contractor responsible for monitoring the site?
This is an interesting question. I guess I'm not entirely sure what you mean, like if you're constructing a facility for the first time, knowing that you're going to need stormwater coverage. So we don't specify where outfalls are required to be. So you can kind of design your site with the topography and the infrastructure for the outfall to fall where you like. There's no requirement from TCEQ about the exact location. And so if you wanted to identify for your contractor where you want those outfalls to be constructed, you can do that. Or if you want to leave it up to them, that's fine too. Just keep in mind that, you might consider if there are multiple water bodies around, maybe one of them has an impairment, and maybe you'd rather not discharge to that water body with an impairment. So you might, kind of switch up the design of your site so that the outfalls don't flow into those particular water bodies. But hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, we got a follow-up message to that it is not the first time it is remodeling construction, just to clarify.
Oh, okay, yeah. So again, it's totally up to you. If you want to remodel it and move that outfall to a different location or adjust it slightly, you can do that. Just make sure that you submit in your notice of change any new information. Like if it's completely moved to locations, you would tell us in that notice of change what's changed. And again, there are no requirements from us that exactly, what location it needs to be. It's up to you to decide how you want it designed and set up, and then just let us know through that notice of change information.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, y'all, I'm going to give it 1 more minute for y'all to send in those final questions. I wanted to remind y'all about that survey form. Please fill that out for us. It's nice and quick and easy, and it really does give us some great information and feedback that helps us keep these webinars going and helps us bring more of them to you to help out with your questions on those environmental regulations. If you do not fill out the attendance form at the beginning of the presentation, feel free to go back and get that sent in now. We'd love to see how many people are joining us and learning today. And then lastly, I have not forgotten, I will send in those, I will send over in the chat those 2 presentation slide links put together. Okay. All right, we have a couple more questions that came in. So this next question, speaking of outfalls, we are getting ready to add a 4th one close to the other 3. What are the sampling requirements? Do we need to sample each outfall, or can we not sample one if it's too close to the other?
Great question. So you are required to conduct sampling from all of your outfalls when there's discharges, unless you identify that there is one representative outfall. So there is language in the permit about, if all of your outfalls are substantially similar, you could do your sampling from just one. You'd have to demonstrate that they're substantially similar. So since those 2 are going to be so close to one another, maybe that's a route you want to take. And if that's the case, you would just do the sampling from one of them, and the other one you would use NODI codes for, because you're indicating that they are representative.
Okay. And then what would, on the same topic, what would the NODI code be for substantially similar outfalls?
Great question. I don't have them all memorized, so I might go back and look at them, but I think that NODI code 9, the conditional monitoring, not required this period, and it would be basically it's not required this period because you are using a representative outfall instead. But I'll take a second and go find the list of NODI codes and just confirm that that's the appropriate one.
Okay. All right, please explain again. During reporting benchmark, if your 12 metals do not exceed, when sample is taken, what NODI code must be used? The 12 metals were sampled.
That would be NODI code 9, conditional, not required, because you're only required to report your exceedances.
That's
All right.
for, I just want to clarify. So yeah, you're not required to report hazardous metals if you don't have any exceedances, but if you have benchmark, you need to report those no matter what.
Right.
Okay, great. All right, next question. If I'm just starting as a safety technician and I'm going to be doing the environmental aspect of it, what would be my role on CDX?
It depends on if they are going to be signing and submitting the DMRs. A responsible official can delegate that signatory authority to anybody, that they deem qualified to do it at the facility. So if you're just going to be viewing the cores or editing, just being responsible for the data, you would just need to be permitting no signature. But if you were going to at least be a signatory at some point or a backup signatory, you would need to be a permittee signature. Because if you choose permittee no signature, you will never be able to have a signatory role. But if you choose a permittee signature, you can just get an edit role with that CDX role. So it kind of leaves it open-ended if you need to become a backup signatory later on.
Okay, great.
Eric, could
All
I
right.
just, sorry, I had a second to look at the NOTI code, so I thought I'd circle back on what to do if you're using the representative outfall. And it will be that NOTI code 9, conditional monitoring, not required this period. So if you're using one representative outfall, you would use the NOTI code on your other outfalls and just report your sampling from that representative outfall.
Okay, great. All right. So we have no more questions in the Q&A box right now. So we're going to wrap up the webinar for today. Thank you all so much for attending. If you have any questions that come up after we finish up the webinar today, feel free to email those questions over to the various email boxes that have been talked about today. So we have the email support for Net DMR at netdmr@tceq.texas.gov. Then we have the stormwater processing email box that is swgp@tceq.texas.gov. And then we have the stormwater permitting email box at swpermit@tceq.texas.gov. Also be sure to fill out that survey. I can go ahead and post that survey link again in the chat. And if you look in that Q&A box, you can now see there at the bottom, both the links to the presentation 1 and presentation 2 are included there. So feel free to get those and download them as well. This webinar was recorded today, so it will be published to the YouTube channel of TCEQ at a later date whenever it is ready and goes through. All right, thank you all so much for attending today, and y'all have a wonderful day.